It'll be like Dr. What was the doctor on the Enterprise?
Bones. Dr.
Bones.
McCoy.
Right. Dr. McCoy, he just had to use his sensors and he could apply treatments, but he ended up being a confidant to the captain. He was somebody that people knew they could go to for help. Maybe that's what we'll evolve into.
Hi, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester.
And welcome to the second episode of What's with RWE.
We have a really special guest with us today. We have Dr. Gerald Batist from the Siegel Cancer Center in Montreal. He is the director of the Siegel Cancer Center. And on top of that, he is one of the founders of Exactis Innovation, and he is our current chief medical officer as well. So welcome to the podcast, Jerry. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm great. Happy to be part of this.
But before we jump in and start asking questions, were you ASCO, Jerry?
Just virtually.
Just virtually. So I was at ASCO, and look what I brought to ASCO with me. So this is what I wore.
Fantastic.
It's amazing. Did you get flagged down at all? Stopped and get pictures with people?
A couple of times. And usually the times I get flagged are always the times I'm rushing off to another meeting.
Of course.
And then someone asks for a picture. I got plenty of how's it going, A. That seemed to be the most common thing that I was asked. But yeah, no, it was a really fun time. It also obviously broke the ice with people. People at this meeting tend to be quite intense in general because it's, obviously a very important meeting for everyone. Everyone's always very busy. So it added some levity to the conversation.
Excellent.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Great. So, Jerry, maybe you can tell the audience here, the billions of people that are watching today, of course, right? A little bit about yourself, and then, maybe we can start from there.
I grew up in Montreal and went off to college in the States and then came back to Montreal to go to medical school. And ultimately, I ended up leaving again for postdocs and further clinical training. And I became a medical oncologist and also a molecular pharmacologist. So early on in my training, there was always both a very intense research component and clinical component.
So how did you decide to become a medical oncologist? I think there's an entire universe of interesting fields to go into. What drew you into this particular area?
It's a really good question. It's hard to find exact influences. There was a very interesting medical oncologist in New York City where I did my internship. We asked him as house staff to see a patient who had a cancer, and he came back, and he was a very brilliant guy and kind of a wild guy. And he wrote on the consult, "I don't know really what she has. I do know that she needs doxorubicin," which was one of the most powerful chemotherapy agents at the time. And I thought, that's absolutely crazy. Yet, this is the area that needs some refinement. And I think there were personal influences, people in the family that got sick. But I think the most interesting part of it was actually two components. One, cancer's always been the cutting edge of science. Because we could grow tumor cells more easily than normal cells, we're able to learn about cell physiology, even normal cell physiology, much earlier. And so it's been the leading edge even in clinical trials because the stakes are so high. People are so sick that it's been more ethically acceptable to move forward with experimental treatments. And then on the personal and emotional side, people become very intimate about serious illness. And I like that. I like the sharing, and all sort of pretensions seem to drop away very quickly. And so even while I was in training, every time I was among cancer patients, I found it intriguing on both those levels, the academic, intellectual level and emotional level.
Do you find it draining, Jerry? And the only reason I ask, because I asked quite a few medical oncologists a very similar question to what Kostas asked you about just out of all the realms of possibility, it seems like becoming a medical oncologist is actually quite challenging. It's, quite honestly quite dreadful. It seems like you deal with death all the time. So how do you cope with that type of reality?
Yeah, it's a obvious and important question. First of all, it is coping. It's not feeling. So I was just talking with a resident yesterday. We were seeing patients, and she felt some of the patient's pain, and I told her that's very good. That means you're alive. It's a human thing. You don't want to not feel it. So the response to it, the coping response, is not to not feel it, but in fact to admire it, to recognize the dignity that these people exhibit as they face mortal illness, the love that their family expresses to them. And it's actually quite inspiring. So, in some ways, it's uplifting. And although a lot of people, when I say I'm an oncologist, say, oh, that must be very dark and depressing and exhausting, I think it probably is all of those things as well. But more than anything, it's really quite uplifting and inspiring. And I should say, and we'll get into this, I guess, the positive side of it is becoming more prominent. Almost monthly, we're seeing much better outcomes for our patients. So it's actually very exciting.
Yeah, I would say that the exciting thing about going to a conference like ASCO, which is for the individuals who don't know, ASCO is the largest probably oncology meeting, at least clinical oncology meeting in arguably probably the world. Something like 50,000 people.
Right.
Vast majority are medical or oncologists or doctors who treat cancer go to this event. Actually, just so you know, Jerry, this year it was overshadowed by someone even bigger than cancer. You can think of it as Taylor Swift was in town. She had her concert for over the same 3 days as ASCO. So all the Taylor Swift fans were actually in town as well, which made the city very, very interesting, very vibrant, I would say.
I think probably there was a subpopulation that overlapped. There were probably Taylor Swift oncologists there. Those would have been the most exciting people at the ASCO meeting.
There were ones wearing the bedazzled white coats. So
That's right.
excellent.
Exactly, exactly.
You touched on the fact that this is a rapidly changing field where there are pretty significant breakthroughs every day, and not just about extending life, but the quality of life opportunities out there have radically changed since a decade ago, even I'd say. And then even the opportunity for cure or near cure has really come to the forefront. But I think the over the last couple of years, there's been some pretty significant barriers that have been put in our way, and some real challenges that have risen. I wonder if we maybe can start by looking at what are some of the challenges that you face day to day, or that you think are the biggest barriers to all of these remarkable new technologies and opportunities coming down the pipeline.
All of the barriers. Well, I'll talk about the barriers, but I just in the context that I see it right now. For I would say 10 years ago, we felt that we had really turned the corner and were able to kind of promise to the population at large, that we are converting the acute mortal illness of cancer into a chronic, manageable disease. Without really understanding that chronic, manageable disease is quite debilitating, quite exhausting, a burden on family and economic burden on society. We've gotten terms for all of these things, and that this isn't good enough, and that we should be aiming for, as you said, curing people. And I think now the contours and the contents of the near future of cancer care are becoming coming into focus. And if we can imagine it, why can't we realize it? And there are some specific barriers. I mean, some of the barriers were the barriers of scientific knowledge and translating scientific knowledge into the clinic. I think we can overcome all of that. But the barriers now are largely regulatory, bureaucratic barriers that actually don't make any sense. And I'm inspired, for example, where I work is also where a very famous scientist named Mark Wainberg worked, and he helped select 3TC out of a chemical batch of drugs. It was one of the first effective anti-HIV drugs. And so, I got to watch him. He became eventually the head of the International AIDS Society. If you watched what happened there, people facing every bit of urgency, maybe more, of what we experienced the past few years in our pandemic, everybody with HIV died, every single person in the 80s. And so there was absolute urgency and panic. And they turned their energies towards knocking down anything that was going to obstruct rapid approval of new drugs. What did they do? They went to the FDA. They said, we're going to completely screw up your trials. You're doing a randomized trial, a placebo versus a potentially effective drug. We're going to get together in our apartments and mix up all our pills in a circle and then redistribute them pill share so that your studies are absolutely meaningless. And following through on those threats, they got the FDA to recognize that nothing made an HIV positive patient survive but an effective drug. Now, in our context, nothing makes a human tumor shrink but an effective anti-cancer therapy. And so all of these 1,000-patient randomized phase 3 trials of unselected patients, patients that may vary in a variety of ways at a molecular level, mean nothing and are wasting human lives and really are not discerning in the most rapid way possible the best treatment. We also know that drugs are actually come to Health Canada late because Canada is a small market. And when they come to Health Canada and then go through the reimbursement process, it takes a year or a year and a half. So we're talking about a couple of years between when a drug is acceptable to a very fine regulatory agency like the FDA or the European Medical Agency, and it becomes available to our patients. That's crazy. And that's a year or 2 years equals lives lost. And so all of this kind of has to be moving at the speed of cancer, not at the speed of bureaucrats. My point is that there are multiple steps that are getting in the way of our giving our patients access to effective therapies. Therapies actually that can cure them. And that's insane as a society. So I view everything now in the context of the pandemic. And in the worst part of the pandemic, the mortality rate was maybe 1/5 or 1/10 the mortality of cancer. During the pandemic, we had urgency and panic, and we put resources into getting these things to patients, all the vaccines and the antivirals, et cetera, to patients as quickly as possible. Why is cancer death not as urgent as a death from an infection in a pandemic? It makes no sense. It boggles the mind. And so that's part of my mission. And finally, just to take us, I think, where we want to get to, and your T-shirt, there are models being used in other countries to approve drugs faster based on minimal initial data, conditionally approved drugs with a follow-up to accumulate more data in the real-world evidence kind of format to confirm the initial submission. And there is no reason in the world why this shouldn't be adopted as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think there's a couple models when we think of regulatory approvals that we're seeing now emerge. So obviously the one you're talking about there is yeah, absolutely, you get phase 2 data and then you confirm that data either in one of two ways, either through traditional clinical trial programs, which I think is the preference still for most, or depending on the scenario, through real world evidence. I mean, you're going to be utilizing it if you're doing that early approval in the broader population. So being able to have more generalizable effectiveness data, I think is would trump anything you'd probably end up finding in a phase 3 in that type of a scenario. But the other thing that is a simple first step, almost if you think about it, is what the UK is doing, right? So they've created this international recognition framework where they have looked at countries that have similar approaches to the regulatory process, right? So whether it's the FDA, Japan, the European agency, Australia, and they basically said, and Canada, and they basically said, if there is an approval in one of these regulatory agencies, we will mutually approve that. There's always a final say by the local regulator if there is something very specific that they are concerned with, but otherwise, it obviously helps to expedite the process.
Right.
So I think that's one of those things that is an easy sort of adoption. Then the next step is absolutely, how do you even go faster than that? Because that still means that a full package as it's defined today, with all the clinical data, all the clinical trials being submitted to at least one of these agencies before the others recognize it. So I think it's almost a two-step. I think there's some very quick things that could be done to accelerate the access, and then the next step is, all right, so then how do we use additional data? And I think that's really the question. Is there a role for real world evidence, essentially, in your mind?
Yeah, I'll give you another way that we can actually post facto improve the cost efficacy of drugs. We have a small group of physicians across the country that meet every couple of months just to discuss this kind of advocacy. And one of the younger members, who is maybe I wouldn't say naive, but she's listening to the arguments of the regulators. She's saying, well, maybe there's some value or in listening to CADETH or the reimbursement of parts of the government saying, we have to think about whether or not we want to spend $100,000 a month to extend median survival by 3 months. And I explained to her, when we talk about median survival, because that's a rabbit hole that we get pushed down. Median survival means half the people are fully alive and may live a very long time, and half the people have progressed. And so probably if we identified the right people, a la precision medicine, and treated only those patients, we would be paying $100,000 a month, which itself, of course, is probably overly expensive, which is another topic. But for prolonging life for many people for a very, very long period of time. So if we're giving, for example, an immune checkpoint inhibitor already now approved on the basis of this limited benefit, 3-month or 6-month median survival advantage, and hundreds of thousands of people are getting it, if we were properly wired in order to collect data on all these people, we could now retrospectively go back to their tissue and find the ones that have the long-term benefits and look at their molecular profiles, look at their immune profiles, and see if we could then, using the real-world data that's already there, because they're all getting it in standard of practice, and create a panel of biomarkers to be able to sort them out. And then we'd have to do a prospective validation study. But just on the basis of what we're doing now, we should be able to actually enhance the value of these drugs, pull out the patients that are not benefiting, and move them into other experimental agents. So we're not even fully using what's already on the table. We're treating these people, collecting clinical data, but it's not warehoused anywhere. That's what we want to do with Exactis. So I think this means everyone understanding the value of the data that's already there and how we could use it. That's real world data of our standard of practice treating patients. I just wanted to also say that the cost of these, it does seem very high. And that's often used against us advocates of accelerated approval, because these brutish pharmaceutical companies are charging exorbitant prices, et cetera, et cetera. Number one, they generate these prices using an algorithm that itself is changing. Because 1 in 20 or 1 in 10 of their drugs that they spend a lot of money developing actually is a hit, gets approved, and because it takes a long time, many patients, many years. But as we develop precision medicine, we're identifying patients and we're getting drugs approved in shorter times with a couple of hundred patients, and their hit rate is going up as well. So I have asked CEOs of big pharmas if we can do that, if we can help you increase the hit rate, shorten the number and decrease the number and shorten the duration of trials, wouldn't you lower the prices? And the answer is, of course, not yes, but it's not been no. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a unique moment in time when medical scientists are doing exactly what the pharma companies are doing, stratifying patients, we want to find the biology of these subgroups of patients, and they want to find them so they can match them up to their drugs. That's worth something, and we have a social responsibility, I think, to push back on the prices. We have a voice with them, and I think they would listen to us. It shouldn't be coming from government or economists, but I think from people engaged in what is becoming a real partnership.
Well, actually, just let's unpack that a little bit, Jerry, because you went through a lot of information there. Just in case someone's
Sorry.
on the line and they actually are not familiar with some of the terms that you use, maybe we start with just defining what is precision medicine, and then more specifically, what you're speaking about is precision oncology. So maybe you can help the audience just understand what is precision medicine per Dr. Battis.
Very good point. I would say in the cancer setting, and actually any disease setting, a diagnosis that we used to make, we used to call lung cancer lung cancer. All the patients with lung cancer would get the same treatment. And if we wanted to find a new treatment and compare them one to the other, we would just take a bunch of lung cancer patients, give them drug A and another bunch of lung cancers and give them drug B. And if there was a slight improvement from 40 to 50%, we'd call drug B the big winner. 50% of the patients get some benefit. That means 50% are getting all the toxicity and no benefit. Now we understand that lung cancer, like all cancers, is actually composed of subgroups of patients that are uncommon or even rare. For example, there's one kind of lung cancer looks like the other kinds of lung cancers, but if you look at it at the molecular level, it's driven by a specific mutation in a gene called ALK. ALK gets out of place and combines with another gene, and in so doing, it drives the development of a tumor. And this is only about 3 to 5% of lung cancers. Now, making a drug that inhibits the protein that gene makes, inhibits ALK, makes these tumors dramatically shrink for long periods of time. Sometimes they can work a way around it. And so second generation and third generation, now fourth generation ALK inhibitors have been made. But the point is that there's also a subgroup of patients that have a particular receptor, growth factor receptor that's overexpressed or mutated. And there are other drugs that help that subgroup of patients shrink. That's about 15% of lung cancers. There's another group that has another gene mutated. So you see that when you talk about lung cancer now, instead of talking about lung cancer, we have to talk about these subgroups. If you were to give all of the lung cancer patients an ALK inhibitor, you'd see a little blip because it's only 3% that are benefiting. If you just take the patients who have lung cancer that has this ALK mutation, you'd see 90% of them respond. So that's precision medicine, finding the right patient to give the right treatment to at the right time.
Great,
In a word.
Yes, no, that's great. That's a great way to put it. I usually like the analogy of the car, right? If you have if you issue with your car, you don't just go in and like change your entire car or just completely like change everything. What you do is you try to figure out, you diagnose where is the issue within the car, and then subsequently, then you maybe remove the part, you change the part, you improve whatever it actually is being damaged. So that's the analogy I like, but I'm sure there's like a better analogy out there. I'm sure someone has a great one.
I like the car better too, actually.
No, great. So that's good to start. And then I think you really touched on this, Jerry. But going back to this idea of the immune checkpoint inhibitors being able to collect additional data points so that you can then subsequently do analysis to understand from the tissue like what can help you better identify patients that would better react to it. So speaking about that, or at least maybe using that as an example, is that the reason why you and others formed Exactis Innovation. Why did you form Exactis Innovation? Maybe that's the more direct question.
Well, just to, I think the car analogy is great, but just to go back to the, the lung cancer
Yes.
analogy, if you think of lung cancer and drugs that are targeting these 3%, 15%, 5% subgroups, uh, the exercise then you have the drugs. The exercise becomes finding those rare or uncommon patients. How do to find 3 in 100 lung cancer patients, enough to make a study of a couple hundred patients, you have to screen thousands of patients. And so the idea was, at the time when we created Exactis, was to develop a registry and be able to look in the tissues of those patients and help find these uncommon or rare subgroups of patients, and then say to pharma, "Look, we can find these patients for you, and so you can come and they can and do your clinical trials with them." Instead of having to make all kinds of arrangements with every hospital across the country to look at the pathology, get ethics approval, and talk to all the doctors, talk to us. We've done all of that, and that was the initial impetus. And then I think we started to understand that we are accumulating important data, and even for somebody like a drug company thinking about, what should I focus on? If I have a drug that can inhibit this particular uh, enzyme or mutation product, is it relevant? To be able to have a database like ours to do what we would call molecular epidemiology, to look and see how frequent does this occur? In which tumors should I actually be looking? That's the kind of thing that we have the capacity to do as well. We could just look in the database, find this mutation, and see, and tell pharma, you should make a drug that, in 15% of breast cancer patients could be very helpful. And in 3% of stomach cancer patients could also be helpful. So, this is data that's already available. And then finally, we could apply actually precisely what I was talking about. We could look at the database, because we have a unique database that follows the patients. We could see who are the patients that are doing exceptionally well on their treatment, and try to understand, going back then to their tumor and analyzing it, what makes this patient such an exceptional responder. And then that can tell us that patients that have the same molecular profile of their tumor are also going to be exceptional responders. And that's another way of proving or finding a fingerprint or a biomarker, we'd call it, that would guide us to match that patient with a particular drug.
A decade ago, when we look at who was doing the kind of testing, I think we weren't really there yet in Canada in terms of the kind of testing we would have wanted to see. What do you think about where we are today from a testing perspective? Have we caught up? Are we able to actually do the right tests to be able to identify these patients, let alone do anything subsequently in terms of matching them to the right therapy? But from a testing perspective, have we caught up? Are we there yet?
I'd say that it's spotty, and there is no consistent aggressive move to bring this kind of molecular testing to the population across the country. There are jurisdictions where some of it is being done upfront and paid for by the government. There are jurisdictions where it's in the plans. There are jurisdictions where it's not there. And even where it's being done, it's not being done across the board for patients. And so that's where we have a lot of work to do. But it's the cost efficacy of profiling all the tumors is enormous, in being able to identify treatments that are actually going to not just help patients carry on, but perhaps have major responses to their treatment and go back to work and relieve their home caregivers, their family caregivers, so they can go back to work, and unclutter the emergency rooms and the hospitals, and make nurses and pharmacists more available. And so, look, again, I was talking about the contours and the content of the near future. It is imaginable, entirely imaginable. And again, we can put this in the context of the pandemic, that in a number of years, not decades, in a number of years, we'll be taking a tumor sample or a blood sample to a pharmacist or some central registry, and it will go to a central lab where all these things will be done. All of the algorithms generated by artificial intelligence will analyze this and match it to particular treatments. And you'll go back to that pharmacist a week or two later to pick up your precision medicine. And so it sounds a little fantastical, but just the difference between COVID and wave one, which was a mortal illness, disruptive of life and emotional state, but the difference between that and how we think of COVID now, which is not trivial but inconvenient, not a mortal illness. That difference could be the difference between the way we've been thinking of cancer and how we can think of cancer if we can apply these principles more aggressively.
Great, Jerry. We don't want to take up too much more of your time, so maybe just a couple more, but just to make sure some of you out there who may not be familiar with the molecular testing landscape, you need a molecular test primarily because if you don't get tested, you don't know what to do. You would essentially get your standard chemotherapy, right? Jerry, is that probably the right way to frame it?
Yes, I mean, a lot of the testing some of the testing is standard of practice. But if you don't know that, say, if you have breast cancer, that it is a hormone estrogen receptor positive tumor, your doctor wouldn't know to put you on an anti-estrogen, which is incredibly effective. If the doctor didn't know that the tumor has HER2 receptor overexpressed, you wouldn't be put on Herceptin, which is dramatic in terms of its outcomes. So yes, unless we have this universally available, people are missing out.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying that.
It's interesting. I know, Lester, you love the analogies here, but I feel a lot of this really rests on the information and what do you do with it, right? So it's a lot of information that you sift through. You mentioned before the ALK mutation in lung cancer. That's a case where one mutation is so powerful that it's driving really the course of that tumor growth. But it often isn't the case, right? I mean, it's often a case of multiple mutations or copies or you name it that actually is driving the course of that disease. And when I look at what the sort of analogy to that is and funny enough, so Spotify, which I love now for listening to music, is one of those analogies that comes to mind because it takes so much information that it can tell me what music I'm going to like and offers recommendations, right? And I almost feel like no matter how much information we have coming in, until we figure out how do you make sense of it and how do you get it into the hands of the people who are going to make that decision, myself as the person listening to it, that's an easy one. Then how do you get it into the hands of the clinicians? How do you get it in a way that patients can understand what the ramifications are so that they can be part of that decision? It's almost meaningless. Step one was creating all of this information. Step two is once you've captured it, now let's make it meaningful and usable.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I think, some of it is not going to be intuitive, not going to be something that you can readily explain to anyone. In fact, there is a whole, and only understandable, only arrived at, not understandable, but arrived at using artificial intelligence. So a non-intuitive, just trial and error of millions and millions and millions of data points until some links are made, and it's non-intuitive, and out pops guidance that you may not necessarily. You can perhaps go back and understand the biology of it and study it, but there's a whole discipline now of AI explaining to do to GPs who are being given algorithm generated guidance, and they have to understand. Everyone wants to understand, how did we get here, and on what basis would I give this to my patient? So we're going through a revolution in thinking, and we're going through a period where we're not trusting of AI, and we see it as menacing. But I think we're also understanding that it has a power that we should harness for the good. And anything out there can be for good or for bad. I think there's an opportunity for us to grab it. But what it needs to feed on is data, and that's what Exactis has and is offering to all of our colleagues across the country. Is scale, is to get as big as possible in the data world, so that the AI can actually make sense of it and our patients can get the very best treatment.
This is obviously great conversation. And since you opened up this topic, I don't want to go too deep into it because that's another hour. And I know you actually are busy. You have to treat patients, and you have much more important work than just to talk to myself. Maybe Kostas is relatively important, but I'm curious.
I enjoy talking to you. I enjoy talking to you. Go on.
I appreciate it, Jerry. But since we brought up AI, I'm just curious if we can maybe end off on your thoughts around, how do you think your role as a doctor, maybe it's not yourself, but doctors in general in the future, doctors that treat cancer, what is your role when AI is at a scale that is, you think, the perfect world that you see for the cancer, for the cancer patient, the one that you described, where you simply get a test, you go to your pharmacist, they get a drug that completely goes and cures their cancer. So what is the role of a medical oncologist or an oncologist in general once this world is alive?
I used to joke about the idea of working towards my own obsolescence, and I have no problem with that. I used to say that jokingly because it didn't seem like a realistic possibility. Now I think it does, so I do give some thought to what it is I'm doing, because I won't even need to write prescriptions. All of this will be done automatically through some other technology, and I certainly won't have to sit in a clinic. I may appear as a holograph to my patients in their living room every once in a while. And if the algorithm tells them that they need to talk to me, otherwise they'll be talking to a bot for a prescription, or a reliable bot that we've validated works well for guidance on simple things, or a nurse, if that's what the algorithm suggests is best. But I think, we still need to kind of put everything in motion. We need to understand what's happening to the patient. There's side effects to all of the treatment. So we end up, that's what we're doing a lot of with the current immunotherapy, is looking for and managing toxicity. There's no perfect drug. There are always what we call off-target effects. They're not related to the tumor, but can affect other organs. And so we end up being general doctors, providing emotional support to the patient, to the family. Cancer is a family affair, and guiding them. And tumors evolve, and we may have to change treatment. So there still has to be someone involved, but it's not necessarily my knowledge of particular treatments that's going to be important. It's going to, again, I think, a lot, as we go forward, we go backward. It will require us to be human care providers as physicians, once we're defined in the more human sense, even if we're in a holograph. And I think, we have to be ready for that and accept that. I think that's a great thing, if that's what we're doing. It'll be like Dr. What was the doctor on the Enterprise? He was Scotty. No, Scotty was the engineer, but Dr.
Bones, Dr.
Bones,
McCoy.
Right, Dr. McCoy. He just had to use his sensors, and he could apply treatments, but he ended up being a confidant to the captain. He was somebody that people knew they could go to for help. And, so maybe that's what we'll evolve into, but it's going to be different.
Great,
I
great,
love it.
great.
In a tech forward world, humanity still wins. That
Agreed.
is the kind of optimism I would expect from a medical oncologist. I love it. Come first full circle in our discussion. So, Jerry, with that, I think maybe we'll wrap it up and let you get back to doing what you do best. And thank you for being a part of our conversation today. And Lester, anything to add in?
Yes. The only thing I have to add is thank you everyone for listening in to the second episode of What's with RWE. And of course, if you like this episode, please, you can add your comments down below. Remember to subscribe, hit that like button, and we'll see you next time. So thank you very much, everyone. And Jerry, do you have any last parting words for everyone?
Just stay tuned for episode number 3, but this has been a great experience. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Jerry. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Not at the speed of bureaucrats. Someone just sneezed.
Yeah, sorry. There's someone in the
It's
background.
fine.
Don't worry, we'll chop it up.